Rain beat down on the old cardboard boxes like a drum, and each drop felt like a small hammer tapping at Ruby's tired bones. Her clothes were soaked through, and her hair clung to her forehead. She stood in the narrow alley, hugging herself for warmth. The wind howled between the tall, crumbling walls, almost as if it were whispering every one of her secrets. The pungent smell of rotting garbage rose from overturned bins, and a stray cat, thin as a twig, meowed as it searched for scraps. Ruby brushed away the cat and took a hesitant step forward, feeling dirty water seep into the holes of her worn shoes. The night was too dark. The alley lamps flickered now and then, but their uncertain glow only made the shadows grow more intimidating. Her breath came out in ragged bursts, and she could taste the stale air mixed with the salt of her tears. Ruby was exhausted. The day had been cold from the start, and her joints ached as if she had aged beyond her 30 years. Deep lines were etched on her face, the kind that told stories of sorrow and yearning. She had not eaten a real meal in days, maybe weeks. It was hard to keep track of time when survival took all her energy. There had been moments, though, when she remembered a special date was drawing close, her birthday. She could recall that as a young girl, she used to bake a small cake with her mother. Her mother's laugh would echo in their tiny kitchen while the smell of chocolate filled the air. That memory stung her heart now, like a bee's sharp sting. Another year had passed, and she had nothing, not even a dry spot to sleep, let alone a friend or a comforting presence. She told herself it was just another day. She tried to push away the sadness, but it kept creeping back. The alley led to a makeshift spot she thought of as her home. It was beneath an old fire escape, where a bundle of blankets, newspapers, and a tattered sleeping bag offered some sense of safety. She had chosen this hidden area because fewer people wandered there. If someone found her corner, they would usually leave her alone. Yet, that night, something felt different. Ruby felt a strange knot in her stomach. She had walked the same path hundreds of times, but somehow the wind sounded more ominous, and the darkness felt heavier. She paused before turning the last corner, noticing footprints in the moist ground. Footprints that did not belong to her. Her heart fluttered. Had someone discovered her tiny refuge? She hoped not. It was the only place where she felt a bit of control over her life. She crept forward, each step slow and quiet. The rubber of her shoes squeaked on the wet pavement, and the noise made her flinch. The closer she got to her sleeping area, the more her pulse raced. She found herself holding her breath when she spotted something unusual, the glow of a small flashlight bouncing on the bricks of the building. Ruby ducked behind a trash bin, her eyes darting left and right. She did not want any trouble, but she also could not afford to lose her sleeping spot on this cold, rainy night. As she stood there, the raindrops dripping from the rim of her hoodie, she wondered if she was brave enough to confront whoever was there. Maybe it was just another homeless person seeking shelter. Maybe they would be friendly, and they could share the space. But worry gnawed at her. She did not have anything worth stealing, but that did not mean others would not try. In these streets, people fought over scraps of food and warm blankets. Ruby was not a fighter. She simply wanted peace. She bit her lip, her teeth chattering, and decided to take a chance. Step by step, she approached the corner where her makeshift bed was tucked away. Her heart pounded in her ears, and the alley seemed to close in on her, as if the walls were pushing her forward toward some dark fate. The flashlight flickered off, and a man's voice let out a soft gasp. Ruby froze. She could see a silhouette crouched on the ground, rummaging through her bedding. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the figure for a split second. A man in a dark coat with hair plastered to his forehead. He was shivering. He lifted his head, and their eyes locked in that one brief moment of brightness. There was something there, fear, sorrow, desperation. Then the light disappeared again, plunging them both into shadow. Ruby clutched her chest, struggling to steady her breath. She felt something was about to happen, something far beyond her control. The air was thick with tension, and she worried that her quiet life, as hard as it was, might never be the same after this night. The alley was a place few outsiders dared to venture. Most people passed by without looking, leaving homeless souls like Ruby to their own lonely existence. She had gotten used to that. She had resigned herself to a silent life, ignoring stares or pity from strangers. She had struggled for many years, doing small chores here and there, only to lose what little she earned on bad luck or worse timing. Her mother had passed away when she was young, and her father was long gone before that. She had no siblings, no family members who cared to find her. This was the only life she knew. But as she stood there, soaked by the rain and shivering from the cold, she realized she was not as alone as she believed. Someone else had ventured in. Someone with an expensive looking coat, even if it was drenched and stained by the alley's grime. She tried not to panic, but her mind spun with questions. Why was this man here? Why was he rifling through her bedding? Was he trying to steal something, or was he hiding from someone? Gathering her courage, Ruby took another step. Her voice came out shaky. "Who are you?" she asked, just loud enough to be heard over the rain. The man jerked around, his face half lit by a flickering street lamp. She could see he was not much older than her, maybe in his mid-30s. His cheeks were sunken in, but not from hunger. It looked more like stress or exhaustion. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he just stared at her with a mix of dread and shame. Ruby's heart softened, despite her fear. This man did not seem dangerous. If anything, he looked lost, frightened. She came closer, letting her guard drop slightly. Her steps sloshed in the puddles, and the stench of the alley seemed stronger than ever. But she focused on the stranger. She tried to study him. His wet, curly hair, his trembling hands, and the way his coat clung to his muscular frame. He was not the usual kind of person she found in alleys. There was a certain grace in his features that suggested he belonged to a world of polished floors and bright lights. Eventually, he managed to speak. His voice was low, like a hoarse whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing at the dirty blanket in his hand. I was looking for a place to hide from the rain. I didn't know it belonged to someone." He lowered his head in apology, and in the dim light, Ruby thought she saw tears shining in his eyes. For a moment, Ruby was too stunned to reply. It had been so long since someone offered her even a hint of remorse. She had grown used to harsh words and dismissive gestures from passers-by. This was different. She inched closer, her curiosity winning over her caution. "It's okay," she said, her voice quieter now. "It's not much, but it's all I have." The man gently put the blanket down on the soggy cardboard that served as Ruby's bed. He stepped back and hung his head, as if he was ashamed to even stand near her belongings. That was when she noticed his face more clearly. In the pale light, he was handsome, but also tormented. The lines on his forehead suggested a recent hardship, something that weighed heavily on him. She noticed how slender his fingers were, with nails that looked manicured not too long ago. His coat, though muddy now, was a high-quality fabric that most homeless people would never touch. There was a small golden pin on the lapel, shaped like a stag's head. She could not stop staring at that pin. It made her think of wealth, of fancy offices where men in suits sat around glossy tables discussing business deals. She wondered what twist of fate had brought him here. Ruby knew what it was like to be stuck in a terrible place, but she had never seen a millionaire enter her world like this. The man still had not offered his name, and she was too nervous to ask. Instead, she motioned for him to come under the fire escape where it was a bit drier. She felt a small pang in her chest, the realization that she was trying to comfort someone in a place that offered almost no comfort at all. He nodded in thanks, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. His lips trembled when he tried to speak again. "I didn't think I'd find anyone here," he said softly, glancing at the dripping ceiling above them. "I'm sorry for intruding." Ruby squeezed some water out of her sleeves. "Well, you found me," she replied. She tried to manage a smile, though her stomach was knotting with concern. "Why are you out here? Did you lose your way?" The man's eyes darted around the space, as if looking for an escape. He hesitated, swallowing hard. "Something like that." He rubbed his hands together for warmth. "Let's just say, I needed to disappear for a while. I had nowhere to go. Then I saw this spot." He did not elaborate. Ruby felt she should not push. They were strangers, after all, and she had her own reasons for being cautious. Instead, she reached into a corner where she kept a plastic bag filled with random items she collected. Pulling out a damp piece of cloth, she offered it to him. "It's not much, but you can dry your face," she said. His eyes glistened with thanks. He took the cloth and dabbed it over his cheeks and forehead. The thunder rolled overhead, and the rain showed no sign of stopping. For a fleeting moment, they stood there, side by side, sharing the silence of a storm. The downpour continued, a steady roar that drowned out the distant sounds of the city. Ruby studied the stranger's face as best she could in the faint light. She had seen plenty of people in dire straits, but this man's eyes spoke of a torment she could not fully understand. She had no clue that he was a millionaire, nor did she suspect the magnitude of the wealth he must have once had. All she saw was another lost soul. In her rough life, she had learned not to judge others too quickly. Some ended up on the streets because of poor choices, some due to mental health struggles, and others simply because fate dealt them an unlucky hand. Yet, this man seemed so different from the usual faces. She felt compelled to know his story, but she also remembered how people had looked at her with curiosity she found intrusive. She did not want to be that person for him. Instead, she tried to calm her racing heart by focusing on practical matters. The ground beneath her sleeping bag was turning to mud, so she pulled a few cardboard scraps out of a corner to lay beneath it. She motioned for him to help. "We should raise it a bit, otherwise the water will seep in," she said in a quiet voice. He nodded and bent down to assist, even though water dripped from his coat collar with every movement. They worked together in silence, arranging the cardboard to make a slightly elevated bed. Ruby's sleeping bag was old and torn, but it was all she had. She stretched it out carefully, trying to keep it as dry as possible. The man offered her his own coat, and she was startled by the gesture. "Use it to cover the spot," he said. "I can manage without it." She was about to refuse. After all, it was the nicest thing she had ever touched. But something in his eyes told her he wanted to help. She laid the coat on top of the cardboard, forming an extra layer against the cold. In the dim alley, the coat looked like a regal garment out of place. But she appreciated the kindness. Once they finished, they both stood up and faced each other in the faint glow of the street lamp. The rain still poured outside their small shelter, but it felt like they had carved out a tiny safe haven. Ruby crossed her arms over her chest, trying to hide a shiver. "Thank you," she said, feeling awkward that she had no better words. He nodded, his gaze drifting around. He seemed almost hesitant to speak again. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I'll stay here all night. I'm not sure if it's safe for you. I don't want to scare you or cause trouble." Ruby cleared her throat, uneasy but touched by his concern. "I've been out here for years. I can handle trouble." Yet, her trembling fingers betrayed her nerves. He managed a small smile, one that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. "I'm Dean," he said, letting the words hang in the stale air. "It's nice to meet you." She almost laughed at the ordinary greeting in such an extraordinary circumstance. "I'm Ruby," she replied. "Likewise." For some reason, she felt a bit self-conscious saying her name. It had been a while since she introduced herself to anyone. In her world, names were rarely exchanged, as if sharing them would deepen the wounds of loneliness. Silence returned, broken only by the weather's relentless assault on the alley. Ruby wondered if Dean was truly okay. He looked like a man who had lost something precious. She noted the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his posture. She wanted to offer him comfort, maybe an explanation of how she ended up here, but her tongue seemed tied. Instead, she asked, "Are you hungry?" The question sounded ridiculous. Of course, he must be. Or maybe not. Maybe he had eaten a grand meal earlier, for all she knew. But it was all she could think to say. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a single granola bar she had saved. It was not fresh, but it was something. He stared at the bar, seeming torn between pride and gratitude. Eventually, he accepted it and muttered thanks. Watching him open a wrapper and take small bites, Ruby felt a wave of empathy. She knew what it was like to go days without proper meals. "At least for now," He had something to eat. Then, without warning, he burst into tears. It startled Ruby, and she found herself patting his shoulder. His sobs were soft but intense, as if a dam had broken inside him. He tried to speak through the tears, but the words were jumbled. She did not push him to explain. Sometimes, a person just needed to cry. The tears streaming down his face were a raw reflection of the pain inside him. She sat beside him, letting him finish the granola bar in silence. The echoes of thunder rolled overhead, and she noticed a small flicker in the street lamp, making the shadows dance around them. For the first time in a long while, she felt a tiny spark of connection with another person. It frightened her, and at the same time, filled her with a weird sense of belonging. Dean's sobs subsided eventually, replaced by deep, shaky breaths. He wiped his tears with the edge of his sleeve. The rain began to slow, as if giving them a moment's peace. Ruby realized it must be close to midnight. Another day was about to start. And with that realization, she remembered something that made her chest tighten. It was her birthday. She felt no joy in it. Birthdays had become painful reminders of her isolation and the dream she had lost. She had no cake, no candles, no one singing to her. Her birthday was just another day in the cold. But that night, something was different. She was not alone under that fire escape. For reasons she could not explain, that simple fact carried a strange significance. Dean broke the silence, his voice still rough from crying. "This must look so strange," he said quietly. "Me, sitting here in the rain, intruding on your space like this. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this." He turned his head, taking in the broken bricks, the graffiti-stained walls, the scattering of trash. Ruby shrugged, trying to appear calm. "Life takes unexpected turns," she replied. "Look at me. I ended up here, and I never planned it." She paused, a slight sadness creeping into her tone. "I know how it feels when you've got nowhere to go." Her words seemed to reach him. He nodded, staring at the ground. "You know," he began haltingly, "I used to have everything. A big house, fancy cars, a company that I built from the ground up. People used to call me a brilliant entrepreneur. I was on magazine covers. It all feels like a dream now." Ruby listened without interrupting. She realized she was hearing something deeply personal. Part of her could not believe it. A man who once had all the luxuries of life was now drenched in an alley, sharing her damp piece of cloth for comfort. She recalled the old stories in the news about bankrupt moguls, or the idea of wealthy individuals who vanished after scandal. She wondered if that was Dean's story. He continued, "Things fell apart so quickly. A series of bad deals, some betrayals by people I thought were friends, and a huge scandal that tore my company apart. I can't show my face anywhere without cameras following me, or worse, angry investors. I lost everyone's trust, and maybe I deserve that. I made mistakes. But it hurts. It hurts more than I can say." Ruby nodded slowly. She understood the pain of betrayal in her own way. She did not know the details of his world, with corporate boardrooms and fancy suits. But heartbreak was heartbreak. "I'm sorry," she whispered, because she did not know what else to say. Dean looked up, his eyes bloodshot but full of sincerity. "Thank you," he said. "I don't expect pity. I just needed somewhere to hide. My face is all over the news, and there's no place I can go without being recognized. I saw this alley, and I realized no one would look for me here. That's why I came." He lowered his voice. "I never thought I'd find you, or that you'd be kind to me. Not after everything." Ruby felt a tug in her chest. She wanted to tell him that kindness was all she had left. She had survived harshness, not just from the street, but also from people who thought she was worthless. If she had a chance to ease someone's pain, she would. She turned her gaze to the sky, where the rain was now just a drizzle, falling gently on the alley walls. "Sometimes a small act of kindness can make a big difference," she said. Dean opened his mouth to speak, but he seemed unsure of the words. Eventually, he asked, "How long have you been out here?" She exhaled, trying to recall. "Too long," she answered simply. "I lost my mother, lost my job, lost my apartment. I had no backup plan. The streets were my only choice." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I manage. I do small tasks for a bit of money when I can. I collect cans sometimes. Other times, I rely on shelters. Life's not fair, but I keep going. Dean listened carefully. He wore a sad smile, like he was recognizing a universal truth they both had discovered in different ways. You're stronger than me, Ruby, he said. I've only been without my resources for a short while, and I already feel like I'm drowning. She shook her head, her wet hair brushing her cheeks. We all do what we have to, she said. You'll learn to cope if you have to stay out here. But maybe you won't. Maybe you'll fix your situation. She tried to offer hope, though she did not truly know what his future held. He fell silent for a moment, staring at the small space they shared. Then he reached into his pants pocket and pulled out a small, damp piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a photograph. Even in the dim light, Ruby could see it was a picture of Dean with an older man. They both wore suits and stood in front of a glass building, smiling confidently at the camera. That was me and my mentor, Dean explained. He believed in me when no one else did. After he died, I lost my compass. I made decisions I shouldn't have. I got greedy, I guess. He let out a hollow laugh. Now this is where that greed got me. Ruby gently placed a hand on his shoulder. She wanted to say something reassuring, something that would mend the ache in his voice. But words failed her. Instead, she just stayed there, letting the quiet speak for them. In a way, they both knew that no easy answers existed for their troubles. A cool gust of wind blew, sending a shiver down Ruby's spine. She realized how tired she was. Her eyes felt heavy, and her body pleaded for rest. Yet, sleep in an alley could never be truly restful. Dean looked equally worn out, swaying a bit with exhaustion. She gestured to the makeshift bed they had assembled. You can sleep here, she offered. Her voice cracked from a cold. I'll manage somehow. Dean shook his head vigorously. No, you take the bed. This is your spot. They went back and forth, each insisting the other should have it. Eventually, they settled on sharing. It felt a bit strange, lying so close to a complete stranger, but they did their best to keep a polite distance. They draped the coat and blankets around themselves. The air was still cold and clammy, but at least they were not alone. And in that dim corner under a rusted fire escape, with rainwater dripping from the edges, Ruby closed her eyes. For the first time in ages, her heart felt a glimmer of warmth, like a single candle in a darkened room. She thought about how she had forgotten her own birthday amidst all this drama, and she wondered if, in some tiny way, this moment of shared humanity was her real birthday present. Morning light crept in slowly, turning the alley's gloom into a muted gray. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving puddles that reflected the early sunlight in small, fractured glimmers. Ruby stirred, roused by a sharp ache in her neck and shoulders. Sleeping on the ground was never comfortable, and sharing the cramped space with Dean had made it even more awkward. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, yawning softly. Dean was already awake, his gaze fixed on the street beyond the alley's mouth. He seemed lost in thought, one hand clutching the photo from the night before. Even in the softer morning light, he looked worn out. His eyes were puffy, and his face had the pallor of someone who did not sleep well. When Ruby moved, he turned his head. "Morning," he said, his voice low. She returned the greeting, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off the lingering chill. The city was beginning to buzz with life outside the alley. Car engines, distant chatter, and the hum of daily routines. But here, in this little pocket of the world, time felt slower. They both stood up carefully, shaking off the dampness. Ruby's clothes were still soaked in places, and she felt a slight sting from where the fabric rubbed her skin. Dean picked up his coat, which had helped keep them somewhat warm. It was smeared with grime and had a sour smell. He grimaced but said nothing, slipping it on like a cloak of defeat. "What's your plan?" Ruby asked softly, as they faced the brightening sky. She worried about where he would go next. And strangely, she worried about herself too. Now that she had let someone into her tiny world, it felt odd to think of him leaving. Dean did not answer right away. He stuffed the photograph back into his pocket and took a breath. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I have no one to turn to." My accounts have been frozen. The media is all over my case, and there are people out there who want to see me pay for my mistakes, maybe even physically. Ruby's eyes narrowed with concern. It was one thing to be broke, it was another to have people actively chasing you. That sounds serious, she said. You can't just roam the streets forever, especially if you're in danger. I know, he said, raking a hand through his messy hair. But what can I do? I'm not used to this life. I don't have the skills to hide or survive out here. He swallowed. That's why I appreciate what you did for me last night. I don't know if I would have managed otherwise. Ruby nodded, her thoughts drifting. She recalled hearing about certain shelters where ex-cons or people in trouble could find temporary refuge. But Dean's troubles were different. He might be recognized in those places. After a pause, she said, if you want, you can stick around with me for a while. But I don't have much to offer. We can try to figure something out together. He glanced at her with surprise. I don't want to be a burden. You already gave me half your bed last night. She forced a small smile. I've been on my own for so long, a little company wouldn't hurt. Maybe we can help each other out. The truth was, as hard as her life was, it pained her to see someone as lost as Dean. Even if their worlds had been so different, they were now bound by hardship and the alley's rough embrace. Dean exhaled, nodding gratefully. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to help you too. They decided to leave the alley for a bit, to search for something to eat or at least hot coffee. They gathered what little they had, the sleeping bag, some cardboard, and Dean's now sullied coat. Ruby knew a spot near a small soup kitchen that sometimes served breakfast. If they were lucky, they might get a cup of coffee and a roll. She did not usually go often because lines could be long and supplies were limited. But something tugged at her, telling her they should try. Walking side by side, they merged into the city's morning flow. People brushed past them, barely giving a second glance. Dean kept his head low, wearing a baseball cap Ruby found among her things to hide his face. He had explained that the press had circulated his photo everywhere. Ruby's heart pounded each time she saw someone glance their way, worried that someone might recognize him. But the hustle and bustle of the early crowd worked in their favor. No one paid too much attention. They reached the soup kitchen, a modest brick building with peeling paint, and joined the line of people waiting out front. A volunteer was handing out small styrofoam cups of coffee and simple bread rolls. Ruby smiled at the familiar sight of people helping the needy. She introduced Dean to a few faces she recognized from other nights out on the street. She noticed how he tried to blend in, avoiding eye contact, his posture tense. When they finally got their turn, Dean took the coffee with an almost desperate relief. Ruby savored a moment of warmth herself, feeling the hot liquid course through her chilled body. They found a corner on the sidewalk to sip their drinks. The bread roll was stale, but it was something. Dean ate his slowly, clearly unused to such rough fare. Ruby studied him as he chewed in silence. A part of her wondered if he truly believed he could return to his old life. Maybe that was impossible now. She thought about her own birthday. Should she tell him it was her birthday? Would that even matter? Her life was so far from normal that birthdays felt like a cruel reminder rather than a celebration. Still, the thought gnawed at her. She finally decided to mention it. She said it softly. It was my birthday last night. I just realized it passed. Dean blinked, lowering his coffee cup. Your birthday? Why didn't you say something? A note of surprise and regret tinged his voice. Ruby shrugged, fiddling with the torn edge of her jacket. Birthdays lost their meaning for me a long time ago. I don't really celebrate anymore. She looked away, trying to hide the sadness in her eyes. Dean stared at her, a range of emotions flickering across his face. He looked genuinely upset he had not known. I'm sorry, he said. I wish I could have done something. Anything. His voice carried a deep sincerity. Ruby attempted a light chuckle, though it came out strained. Don't worry about it, she said. I'm used to not celebrating. I just wanted to be honest with you. Yet, in her heart, she felt a faint spark of longing. What would it be like to have a real celebration, even a small one, with someone who cared? Dean pursed his lips, as if thinking over a puzzle. The crowd of hungry people bumped into them now and then, but Dean paid them no mind. His gaze was fixed on Ruby. He seemed on the verge of saying more, but he hesitated. Then, with a determined glint in his eyes, he quietly said, "If I get the chance, I'm going to give you the birthday you deserve." His words startled Ruby. She was not sure if they were realistic or just a kind gesture, but she appreciated the sentiment. She gave him a half-smile, feeling a mix of gratitude and doubt. "That's sweet of you," she said. "But don't worry about me. You need to focus on yourself." Dean nodded, but she could tell that deep down, he was serious about his promise. He took a final sip of coffee and stood up. The sunlight was growing stronger, illuminating the dirt on his once impressive shoes and the wrinkles in his suit pants. "I can't explain it," he said softly, "but something about meeting you last night changed me. I don't want to be the man I was. I want to make things right. Maybe helping you is part of that." Ruby's heart thudded at the earnestness in his voice. She had never expected to be anyone's reason for change. She placed her hand on his sleeve, the damp fabric still cold to the touch. "We'll see how things go," she whispered. They walked away from the soup kitchen, blending back into the city streets. Neither of them had a clear plan for the day, but in that uncertain dawn, they had at least found a sliver of hope in each other's company. As the morning wore on, Ruby and Dean wandered through the city's less crowded streets. Ruby showed him a few places she had come to know: the shady corners where she could sometimes pick up odd jobs, the public library where she warmed up on especially cold days, and a church that allowed people to take short naps in the pews. Dean listened with an intensity that suggested he was studying every word, trying to piece together how survival worked on the streets. They eventually found a small park, its grass patchy and benches scarred by graffiti. A broken fountain stood at the center, long dried out. There, under a half-dead tree, they sat and talked in quiet tones about their lives before misfortune dragged them down. Ruby told Dean about her mother's old stories, the kind that lulled her to sleep when she was little. Dean shared a few memories of his earliest entrepreneurial dreams, how he once sold lemonade as a kid and fantasized about building a multinational company. Their conversation was gentle, as if each word bridged the gap between them. But tension lingered beneath their budding friendship. Dean still worried about being recognized. He glanced over his shoulder whenever footsteps neared. Ruby noticed how his shoulders tensed whenever a police car passed by. She understood. Her own anxiety spiked whenever she saw uniforms, afraid they would chase her away or lecture her about sleeping outdoors. Yet, they both needed to be out in public to scrounge up anything that would keep them going. By noon, their stomachs growled. Ruby suggested they check a community center that sometimes offered free meals. It was not guaranteed, but it was worth trying. They made their way across town, weaving through alleys to avoid large crowds. The sun climbed higher, warming the pavement and drying their damp clothes to some extent. Still, Ruby noticed that Dean's fancy shoes squeaked with each step, caked with dried mud. It was a reminder of how far he had fallen from his once polished existence. They reached the community center only to find a sign that read, "Closed today for repairs. Sorry for the inconvenience." Dean's face fell, and Ruby felt the sting of disappointment in her own belly. Hunger was a relentless enemy. Sighing, she motioned for them to head elsewhere. Sometimes, grocery stores threw out unsold sandwiches or day-old pastries near the back dumpsters. It was not the best option, but it might fill an empty stomach. As they walked toward a nearby stores alley, Dean spoke up, a touch of frustration in his voice. "There must be something I can do. Something better than checking dumpsters." He caught himself, then turned to Ruby with an apologetic expression. "I don't mean to sound snobbish. It's just I hate feeling helpless." Ruby nodded, understanding his embarrassment. "I've felt that way a million times," she said. "But out here, you do what you have to. If you're not comfortable with it, we can try another place. Sometimes, small diners will give away leftover food at the end of lunch hours." Dean looked at her, a fleeting determination in his eyes. "Let's try the diner," he said. "I'll even ask them if they need someone to wash dishes. Maybe I can earn a meal." A spark of hope lit in Ruby's chest. She remembered a rundown diner about 6 blocks away. The owner, a gruff older man, was sometimes willing to help those who offered to do chores. It was a gamble, but worth a try. "All right," she said, "follow me." They arrived at the diner, a narrow place with a flickering neon sign that read Ellie's Eats. The inside smelled of fried eggs and burnt coffee. A few customers sipped drinks at the counter, and a bored waitress flipped through a magazine. Dean, still wearing his soiled suit and muddy shoes, stepped up to the waitress. Ruby stayed close behind, feeling her nerves spike at the thought of being turned away. Dean cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm looking for the owner. I was wondering if I could do any odd jobs in exchange for some food." The waitress raised an eyebrow, giving him a quick once-over. "Ed's in the back," she replied, nodding toward the kitchen. "Knock yourself out, but he's in a bad mood today." Undeterred, Dean thanked her and moved toward the kitchen door with Ruby at his side. They found Ed, a big man with graying sideburns, wiping down a countertop. He glanced up, eyes narrowing at the sight of their disheveled state. "Yeah," he grunted. Dean introduced himself briefly, stumbling over his words. He explained that they were hungry and asked if there was anything he could do: wash dishes, scrub floors, take out the trash, in exchange for a hot meal. Ed eyed them both, his lips pressed into a tight line. He tapped his foot, appearing lost in thought. Finally, he shrugged. "Dishes are piling up," he said. "You wash them for an hour. I'll give you both something to eat. But if you break anything, you're out." Dean nodded eagerly, relief washing over his face. "Thank you, sir." Ed tossed him a stained apron. "Sink's over there. Don't make a mess." His gaze then shifted to Ruby. "You any good at cleaning?" he asked. Ruby nodded. "Yes, sir." He jerked his head toward the front of the diner. "Floors could use a mop. Mop's in the closet. Don't expect a tip from me, but I'll keep my word." They set to work immediately. Dean plunged his hands into hot, soapy water, scrubbing plates and cups. He fumbled at first, unaccustomed to such labor, but after a few minutes he found a rhythm. Ruby retrieved a mop from the closet and started swabbing the sticky floor around the tables. She was used to cleaning up spills in the shelter, so it was not a big deal, but she was worried Ed might change his mind at any moment. Other staff members popped in and out of the kitchen, eyeing Dean suspiciously. They whispered among themselves, perhaps thinking he looked vaguely familiar. Dean kept his head down, focusing on his task. Ruby worked quickly, the strain of hunger making her arms weak. Still, the thought of a decent meal spurred her on. After an hour or so, Ed grunted from the kitchen doorway. "That's enough. I'll dish you up something," he said. Dean dried his hands and helped Ruby put away the mop. They gathered near the counter, and Ed set down 2 plates of food, a couple of scrambled eggs, toast, and a small portion of fried potatoes. It was not fancy, but it looked like a feast to Ruby. She and Dean thanked him and devoured the meal, letting the warm eggs soothe their gnawing hunger. Between mouthfuls, Ruby saw Dean's expression shift from gratitude to determination. She recalled the vow he made about wanting to help her, and she could see the wheels turning in his mind. They finished the meal in near silence, not wanting to lose a single bite to conversation. When they were done, Ed leaned on the counter, arms folded. "You two must really be down on your luck," he muttered, but not unkindly. "You did a decent job. If you need another meal tomorrow, you can come by and do the same." Dean's eyes lit up. "Thank you," he said, genuine relief in his voice. "We appreciate it more than you know." Ed just nodded, then turned away to handle some regular customers who'd just come in. Ruby could barely recall the last time she felt so full, even if it was a simple meal. As they stepped outside, the afternoon sun warming their faces, Dean let out a long breath. "That was more than I expected," he admitted, looking at the diner's shabby sign. Then he turned to Ruby, gratitude plain on his face. "Thank you for showing me where to go. And for everything else." Ruby smiled wearily. "I'm just glad we both got a decent meal," she said. She paused, scanning the street. "Want to go back to our alley spot, or do you have something else in mind?" Dean's gaze drifted from the diner to the busy road, and a strange calm settled over his features. "I'd like to stay hidden, yes," he said. But I also want to start figuring out a way to fix my situation. I can't keep hiding forever, and I can't drag you into danger if I'm being chased. Maybe there's a way to clear my name." Ruby blinked, uncertain how to respond. She had never thought about clearing names or facing the system head-on. She always tried to avoid attention, having learned that the streets provided little mercy once the authorities got involved. "If that's what you want," she said carefully, "I'll stand by you. But I don't have any connections, just so you know." Dean looked at her warmly. "You being there is already enough," he said. With that, they started walking back toward the alley, side by side, carrying the glow of hope that a simple meal and a bit of compassion had sparked within them. When they arrived back at their makeshift shelter, they saw that nothing had been disturbed. No one had stolen their meager belongings. The cardboard and blankets still lay in a small heap. Relief swept over Ruby. It was always a risk leaving one's sleeping spot unattended. They settled down under the fire escape, the shade offering relief from the heat of the afternoon sun. Dean sighed, leaning against the wall. "So how do we start?" he asked, more to himself than to Ruby. "If I reach out to the media or the authorities, I risk being thrown in jail or attacked by those I owe. But if I do nothing, I remain a fugitive on the streets." Ruby did not have an answer. She laced her fingers, pondering. "Maybe there's someone you trust, someone who could hear you out and help?" He shook his head slowly. "Not anymore. My lawyer dropped me when I couldn't pay. My business partner is half the reason I'm in this mess. And anyone else who once knew me is either afraid or angry." The frustration in his voice weighed on Ruby's heart. She remembered the times she had felt cornered, unable to see a path forward. "Maybe you can earn a little money under the table. Find a place to stay that's not so exposed," she offered. "You worked in that diner today. Maybe keep doing that or find other small jobs." Dean mulled it over. "That could work for a while," he said. "But it won't fix the bigger problem. My situation will catch up to me eventually." He rubbed his eyes. "I hate feeling so powerless." The alley fell silent for a moment, broken only by a car horn blaring in the distance. Then Ruby thought of something. "You said your accounts are frozen, but what about your personal items? Do you have anything stashed somewhere safe, documents, or maybe a laptop you can use to gather evidence in your favor?" Dean's brow furrowed. "I had a storage unit, but I'm behind on payments. They might have locked it by now." He paused. "But it might still be worth a try. There are files there that prove my business partner orchestrated half of this scandal." A note of hope crept into his voice. Ruby sat up straighter. "That sounds important. If you can get those files, maybe you can clear your name." She bit her lip. "But how will we get into the storage unit without money to pay the fees?" Dean's eyes flickered with determination. "I'll figure it out. Even if it means picking up part-time gigs like washing dishes or cleaning floors for a few days to gather enough cash. Once I get in, I can retrieve the documents." She nodded. "That seems like our best shot." She paused, then asked, "What if you do prove your innocence? Will you go back to your old life?" Dean looked at her, his gaze softened by an emotion she could not quite place. "If I can clear my name, I'd still have to rebuild everything from scratch. My old life is gone, and I'm not sure I want it back exactly as it was. I've changed, Ruby. Meeting you, seeing how life is for those who have nothing, it's changed me." A subtle tension rose between them. Ruby's cheeks warmed. She looked away, unsure what to do with the sudden closeness she felt. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Let's focus on one step at a time. We'll find the money for the storage unit, get the documents, and figure out the rest." Dean agreed. "Yes, let's do that. Together." They spent the afternoon planning. Ruby knew various spots where odd jobs might be found. Warehouses needing temporary help. Small shops looking for someone to clean after hours. She warned Dean that some of these places paid poorly and often under the table. He shrugged, saying he'd take whatever he could get. They decided to check out a nearby warehouse district. Sometimes foremen, their hired day laborers. With any luck, they might each earn a little cash. So they left their alley again, making sure to hide their bedding in a spot that was less visible from the street. It was always a gamble, but they had to move forward. When they arrived at the warehouse area, they found a group of people already waiting outside a large metal building. A burly man with a clipboard was scanning the group. Ruby recognized this scene, a daily ritual where men in need of work gathered, hoping to be picked for manual labor. She stepped forward, with Dean right behind her. The burly man looked them over. "We only got spots for 5 workers today," he barked. "You willing to haul crates?" Ruby nodded, raising her hand. "We'll do it," she said. Dean gave a firm nod as well. The man pointed at them. "You 2, and you 3, he said, picking out a few more from the crowd. "Come on in." Ruby and Dean followed him inside the warehouse, past tall stacks of boxes and the echo of machinery. The job was simple: move heavy crates from one side of the warehouse to the other. It was repetitive and exhausting, but it promised a small cash payment at the end of the day. They toiled in the dimly lit space, sweat beading on their brows. Dean struggled with the weight at first, unused to physical labor. Ruby showed him how to brace his legs and distribute the load. Over time, he caught on, though she could see the strain on his face. A few other workers teased him about his fancy shoes, but Dean took it in stride. Hours passed, each crate feeling heavier than the last. By the time the sun hung low in the sky, Ruby's arms and back were on fire. But she kept going. She glanced at Dean now and then, watching him push through the fatigue. Something about seeing him adapt, refusing to complain, made her feel proud. Finally, the burly man announced the shift was done. He handed out small envelopes of cash to each worker. Ruby clutched hers tightly, relief washing over her. It was not much, barely enough to buy a meal or 2, but every bit counted. Dean thanked the foreman and pocketed his share. Walking outside, they saw the sky painted with oranges and pinks, the promise of night creeping in. Dean opened his envelope and counted the bills. "It's a start," he said, a small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Ruby smiled tiredly, feeling the ache in her muscles. "We can try to find more work like this. Another day, maybe we'll have enough to pay off some of your storage fees." Dean nodded, but then his grin faded. "I just hope we don't run out of time," he muttered, casting a glance over his shoulder as if he expected to see someone following him. Ruby did not want to think about that. "Let's try to relax for the evening," she suggested. "We can go to that diner again tomorrow if Ed will have us. We'll do whatever it takes." They headed back through the city's labyrinth of streets, the sounds of nightlife beginning to stir. The lights from bars and clubs illuminated their path in patches of neon. Passing crowds made Ruby uncomfortable, but she felt slightly safer with Dean by her side. At last, they returned to their spot in the alley. Exhaustion weighed on them. They spread out their bedding under the fire escape. Ruby felt a pang of gratitude that no one had stolen their few possessions. She sat down, leaning against the wall, letting out a weary breath. Dean joined her, setting his envelope of cash between them. "For now, this is our savings," he said softly. "We'll add to it bit by bit." She nodded, placing her own meager earnings with his. The combined total was still pitiful, but it felt like progress. "We'll keep at it," she assured him. He turned to face her, looking at her in the dim alley light. "I never thought I'd say this," he murmured, "but despite everything, I'm glad I met you." Ruby's cheeks flushed, and she lowered her gaze. I'm glad too," she whispered. The vulnerability of the moment made her heart pound. They were just 2 broken people, trying to make sense of a harsh world. But somehow, being together felt less lonely. They settled down to sleep, side by side again. Ruby cradled the blankets around her, feeling Dean's presence like a quiet promise. Before long, her exhaustion carried her off into a restless slumber. Dream images flickered: her mother's kitchen, a birthday cake, Dean's tear-streaked face. When she woke in the morning, she was not sure if she had dreamed of hope or heartbreak, but Dean's soft breathing beside her reminded her she was no longer alone. Over the next several days, Ruby and Dean fell into a pattern of survival. Each morning, they woke early to either head to the diner, hoping Ed would let them wash dishes or mop floors, or they went back to the warehouse district in search of day labor. Some days they got lucky, some days they did not. When they were turned away, they found small ways to scrape by. Dean grew more accustomed to manual labor, and Ruby showed him where to find helpful resources like public restrooms or quiet spots to rest. Meanwhile, Dean kept track of every dollar they earned, storing the money in a small, hidden pocket of his coat. They ate frugally, sometimes surviving on day-old bread or leftover diner meals. It was a slow grind, but each day they got a little closer to the goal of freeing Dean's storage unit. And as they struggled side by side, their bond deepened in unexpected ways. Sometimes, after a long day, they would sit in the alley, sharing stories. Dean told her about the lavish parties he used to throw, though he admitted he felt emptier than ever afterward. Ruby opened up about her childhood dreams of being a teacher, how she loved the idea of helping kids who were just like she once was. In those hushed confessions, they found an emotional closeness that neither had experienced in a long time. Ruby noticed changes in Dean as well. He became more empathetic, often stopping to help others on the street when he could. She also spotted a certain gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her. They never spoke openly of romance. It was too fragile, too complicated while they lived in an alley, uncertain if they would even see the next week's sunrise without danger. But an unspoken warmth flowed between them, a silent understanding that they cared about each other beyond mere survival. One afternoon, about a week after Dean first stumbled into her life, they tallied their collected earnings. They sat on the ground in a quiet corner, counting crumpled bills under the shade of a broken awning. After summing the money, Dean nodded excitedly. "I think we have enough," he whispered, eyes sparkling. "We can at least try to pay the overdue fees and get into my storage unit." Ruby's stomach fluttered with hope. "Really?" she asked, amazed. The total was meager in normal terms, but on the street, it felt like a fortune. "That's great. We should go right away, before something else comes up." Dean agreed. They decided to leave for the storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Ruby was anxious about traveling so far in case the owners recognized Dean, or if the journey proved a waste. But they had come too far to turn back now. That afternoon, they boarded a bus using part of their hard-earned cash. Dean kept his head low, wearing a hood to hide his features. Ruby found a seat by a dusty window, watching the city pass by in a blur of graffiti-stained buildings, run-down shops, and finally the industrial outskirts. They got off near a wide road lined with storage complexes, each surrounded by tall fences topped with barbed wire. Dean led them to a place called Secure Keepers, a large sign advertising 24/7 surveillance. The gates were open during business hours, so they slipped inside, heading toward the office. A middle-aged woman sat behind a glass partition. She greeted them mechanically. "Name and unit number?" she asked, eyes barely lifting from her computer. Dean cleared his throat, adjusting his hood. He gave her the name Dean Maxwell and a unit number. The woman tapped some keys, then frowned. "You're behind on payments," she said, glancing at the screen. "The unit's locked. You'll need to pay the overdue balance, plus a late fee to access it." Dean slid the money through the partition, carefully counting out enough to cover what she quoted. The woman raised an eyebrow at the wrinkled bills, but did not question him. She processed the payment, then handed him a receipt and a key code. "You can find your unit in Building C, number 209, she said in a bored tone. "You've got 30 minutes before closing." They thanked her and walked out. Ruby felt her heart hammering in her chest. Could the files really be in there? Could they solve Dean's problem? Dean led the way through a maze of identical corridors. The place smelled of concrete and dust. Flickering overhead lights made the rows of units feel like a tunnel. At last, they reached Unit 209. Dean punched in the code on a small keypad, and the metal door slid open. The interior was dimly lit by a single light bulb. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, some labeled with words like financial records, personal papers, photos. He went straight to a green file cabinet in the corner. Yanking the drawer open, he rifled through a series of folders until he found the one he needed. It was marked private, in case of emergency. He clutched it with trembling hands, turning to Ruby with a triumphant look. "This is it," he said, voice quivering with excitement. "Proof that I was set up. Emails, signed documents, everything." Ruby's pulse quickened. "So you can show this to the authorities?" she asked. Dean nodded. Yes, though I might need a lawyer willing to take a chance on me. Or maybe a journalist who wants to uncover the truth. Either way, this is my ticket to clearing my name. He flipped through the papers, eyes shining with relief. Ruby scanned a few pages, seeing technical business jargon she barely understood, contracts, spreadsheets, emails referencing someone named Charles. Still, from Dean's reaction, she knew it was significant. They carefully packed the folder into a small backpack Dean found in a corner. He also retrieved a laptop from another box, though it looked outdated. It should have all my saved contacts and older email threads, he explained. That might help too. Just as they were about to leave, Ruby noticed a smaller box labeled mementos. She gently nudged Dean. "Do you want to take this too?" she asked. Dean hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, sure," he said, picking it up. He opened it briefly, revealing photos, a watch, and some old letters. "Maybe these can remind me of what matters," he added softly, before closing the box again. They locked up the unit behind them, stepping back into the main corridor. Tension hung in the air. If all went well, these documents would change Dean's life. Ruby felt a surge of mixed emotions, excitement for him, but also a twinge of fear. What if the people behind the scandal came after them? What if the authorities were not sympathetic? Outside, dusk had settled, painting the sky a deep purple. The storage facility was about to close, so they hurried out to the street. They had just enough leftover cash to catch a bus back toward the city, though it would drop them off a few blocks from their usual alley. As they boarded, Dean held the backpack close, like a precious treasure. On the ride back, he leaned in closer to Ruby. "Thank you," he whispered. "I couldn't have done this without you." His voice was tight with emotion. Ruby placed a reassuring hand over his, offering a slight squeeze. She did not respond with words, but she hoped her touch conveyed her feelings. They reached their stop and got off, trudging the final blocks by foot. The city lights glittered around them, and the hum of traffic was constant. Ruby noticed Dean's grip on the backpack tighten whenever a car passed too close or someone glanced their way. She understood his paranoia. The folder inside was his lifeline. When they finally slipped back into their alley, Ruby felt a wave of relief. Their familiar corner looked the same as always, dark, dingy, but strangely comforting. Dean exhaled, setting the backpack carefully atop a stack of crates. Ruby unrolled their bedding, her muscles sore from the long day, but her heart thrummed with cautious optimism. Dean rummaged in the backpack and pulled out the smaller box of mementos. "I want to show you something," he said. He opened it, revealing a few photographs of him smiling with an older man. "That's my mentor Victor," he explained, pointing to the man who wore a big grin and had an arm around Dean's shoulders. "He taught me that real success isn't about how much money you make, but how you treat people on your way up. I forgot that lesson for a while." He flipped through a few more photos of fancy events, him shaking hands with important figures. Then he paused at a snapshot that showed a bright-eyed young woman with curly hair. "That's my sister," he said quietly. "We drifted apart after our parents passed. She never approved of how I ran my business. I wonder if she'd talk to me now." Ruby felt a pang in her chest, reminded of her own lost family. "Maybe, if you clear your name, you two can reconnect," she offered gently. Dean nodded. "I hope so." He set the photos aside and dug further, pulling out a slim black box. Opening it, he revealed a delicate gold necklace with a small heart pendant. "I bought this for someone I once thought I loved," he admitted. "But it never worked out, and I never gave it to her." Ruby's breath caught at the sight of the necklace. It was simple but elegant, shining even in the alley's dim light. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Dean stared at it, a distant sadness in his eyes. "I was going to throw it away when I lost everything, but something stopped me." He paused, then turned to Ruby, a vulnerability in his gaze. "I guess I was waiting to find someone who deserved it." A stillness settled between them. Ruby felt her heart race. Dean let out a soft exhale and gently placed the necklace back into its box. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Not tonight," he murmured. "But someday, if everything works out, I'd like you to have it." Ruby's cheeks warmed. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The gesture, the meaning behind it, was more than she could handle in that moment. Her life had been so devoid of affection that something as simple as a small gold heart necklace felt like an overwhelming gift. She managed a quiet nod, and Dean nodded back, as if they had reached an unspoken agreement. They closed the box and tucked the items safely away. Despite the dark alley around them, they felt a flicker of hope light up their uncertain world. The next steps were daunting, finding a lawyer or a journalist willing to break Dean's story, avoiding the threats lurking in the shadows. But they had something precious in their corner, each other. And for now, that was enough to help them face another night on the harsh streets. The following days were a whirlwind of attempts to contact anyone who might help Dean prove his innocence. He tried emailing a few investigative journalists from a public library computer, carefully sending them scans of some documents. He also reached out to an old college friend who worked in local media, though he was not sure if that friend would respond. Tension mounted as they waited. Dean grew restless, pacing the small space under the fire escape. Ruby offered whatever comfort she could, reminding him that processes like these took time. He was torn between urgency and caution. Every day spent on the streets felt like a risk, but rushing things could blow their cover. Their efforts finally bore fruit when Dean got a response from a reporter named Sarah Wynn. She had seen the scans and was intrigued. She asked to meet him in person to verify the authenticity of the documents. Dean hesitated. He worried about revealing himself, but Sarah promised confidentiality. Ultimately, he and Ruby decided it was worth the gamble. They chose a quiet cafe in a rundown part of town. Dean and Ruby arrived early, wearing hats and hoodies to avoid drawing attention. They sat at a corner table, scanning the room nervously. A few minutes later, a woman entered, dressed in casual clothes, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She spotted them and approached. "Dean Maxwell?" she asked softly, eyes wary. Dean nodded and gestured for her to sit. Ruby noticed Sarah's keen gaze taking in everything, from Dean's disheveled appearance to the suspicious backpack at his feet. After ordering modest drinks, the three huddled over the table. Dean pulled out the folder of original documents. Sarah examined them with interest, jotting down notes. Now and then, she asked pointed questions about the timeline, the parties involved, and how the scandal unfolded. Dean answered as best he could, though it was clear some details pained him to remember. Ruby watched Sarah's reactions carefully. The reporter's face remained composed, but occasionally her eyes widened at a particularly damning piece of evidence. After nearly an hour, Sarah leaned back, letting out a small whistle. "This is quite the bombshell," she said quietly. "If these documents are real, it means you were set up by your partner, and the scandal that ruined you was orchestrated to shift blame onto you." Dean nodded, mouth dry. "That's exactly what happened. I was careless, I admit, but I didn't commit fraud. I need the public to see the truth." Sarah drummed her fingers on the table, scanning the cafe for eavesdroppers. Satisfied no one was listening, she lowered her voice further. "I can help you," she said, "but it's risky. Once I break this story, it might anger some powerful people. Are you ready for that?" Dean swallowed hard, remembering the threats and the betrayal. Then he glanced at Ruby, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "I'm ready," he said firmly. "I just want my name cleared." Sarah nodded. "All right, I'll need some time to verify details and speak to my editor. But if this checks out, we'll publish a piece revealing the real culprits. It could exonerate you." Dean exhaled, relief and anxiety mingling. "Thank you," he murmured, gripping Ruby's hand under the table. She squeezed back, her heart racing at what this might mean for them both. Sarah stood, gathering her notes. "I'll be in touch. But stay under the radar until then. Once news breaks, the people who framed you might come after you to keep you quiet." She paused, shifting her gaze to Ruby. "You watch each other's backs, okay?" Ruby gave a firm nod. "We will." They parted ways quickly, anxious not to draw attention. Back in the alley, Dean and Ruby felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, there was a clear path forward. Yet, the fear of retaliation loomed. Each night, they slept fitfully, half expecting footsteps approaching in the darkness. A week later, everything changed. Early one morning, a storm of media coverage erupted. Sarah had published her article, complete with scanned documents and quotes from anonymous sources, confirming the validity of Dean's story. The headlines read, "New evidence clears disgraced entrepreneur, corporate conspiracy unveiled." The piece went viral fast. Suddenly, reporters were roaming the city, seeking Dean Maxwell. Some for interviews, others for sensational angles. Ruby and Dean hunkered down in the alley, uncertain what to do next. They had no phone, no safe place to hide, and no resources to flee. But a lifeline arrived unexpectedly, an email from a reputable lawyer who specialized in corporate fraud cases. The lawyer believed in Dean's innocence and offered pro bono representation, hoping to gain both justice and publicity. Dean's eyes lit up reading the email in the library. "This might be it," he said, voice trembling. "With a good lawyer, I can finally face this head-on." Ruby watched the mixture of hope and dread flicker across his features. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's do it," she said softly. "Let's clear your name once and for all." They arranged to meet the lawyer, Ms. Donovan, at her downtown office. It meant stepping right into the public eye, an intimidating step for someone who had been hiding in alleys. But the possibility of freedom was worth it. They scraped together bus fare again, heading into the heart of the city. The tall buildings loomed, and Ruby felt out of place among the polished crowds hurrying to business meetings. Dean wore the best outfit he could manage, still the same suit, cleaner now, but obviously worn and tattered. They entered Ms. Donovan's office, which occupied a small suite in an older building. The waiting room had plush chairs and potted plants, a far cry from the grit of the streets. After a short wait, they were ushered into her office. She was a poised woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a confident demeanor. "Mr. Maxwell," she greeted him, extending a hand. She then turned to Ruby. "And you must be Ms. Ruby? Sarah mentioned you briefly." Ruby nodded shyly, feeling self-conscious. Ms. Donovan invited them to sit, then dove straight into the details. She had read Sarah's report and had been given copies of the evidence. "It's very convincing," she said, tapping a stack of papers. "We can file a motion to reopen your case. We'll also seek a formal investigation into your former partner's actions." Dean listened, hope brightening his face. Ms. Donovan explained the risks and complexities. They might face countersuits or intimidation, but she believed their evidence was strong enough to withstand attacks. By the end of the meeting, Dean signed some forms granting her the authority to represent him. Ms. Donovan gave them both a measured look. "There's one more thing," she said. "The press will want your statement. It might be wise to present your side publicly, show that you have nothing to hide. But you need a place to stay away from potential threats. Let me see if I can arrange a temporary safe location." Ruby almost laughed. The idea of a safe house sounded like something out of a spy movie. But it was clear Dean needed protection. And, by extension, so did she. Ms. Donovan made a few phone calls, eventually securing them a short-term stay in a modest apartment owned by a charitable organization that helped victims of fraud and legal harassment. Dean could barely contain his gratitude. "Thank you so much," he told Ms. Donovan. "You have no idea how much this means to us." The lawyer shook his hand again. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "We still have a long fight ahead. But if everything goes as it should, you'll be able to walk free with your reputation restored." They left the office, a rush of excitement and relief coursing through them. Outside, the city lights had begun to flicker on, reflecting off the windows of tall buildings. Cars honked, people bustled, life continued. But for Dean and Ruby, the world felt suddenly filled with promise. Dean turned to Ruby as they stood on the busy sidewalk. He gently took her hand, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. "We did it," he whispered, squeezing her fingers. "We actually did it." Ruby looked back at him, eyes stinging with tears of joy. She laughed softly. "Not all of it yet, but it's a start." He pulled her close in an impulsive embrace. For a split second, the city noise faded, leaving only the warmth of his arms around her, the gentle press of his cheek against hers. Then, as quickly as it started, he let go, flustered but smiling. Ruby felt heat flood her face. They caught a cab Miss Donovan had arranged, an unimaginable luxury just days ago, and headed to the small apartment. The building was old, with peeling paint in the hallway, but it was heaven compared to the alley. They had a clean mattress, a functioning bathroom, and a door with a lock. That night, lying on an actual bed for the first time in years, Ruby stared at the ceiling, her mind swimming. Everything was happening so fast. She cast a sideways glance at Dean, who rested on a small cot across the room. He was already asleep, exhaustion etched on his face. She felt a tender ache in her chest, a mix of love and worry for the man who had stumbled into her life on that rainy birthday night. The legal process moved quickly, spurred on by the media coverage. Over the next week, Ms. Donovan filed motions, presented the evidence in front of the court, and drew attention to Dean's innocence. News outlets picked up the story, calling it a major twist in the once infamous Maxwell scandal. While Dean's former partner faced mounting legal pressure, Dean himself was approached by various companies offering him interviews, intrigued by his resilience and newfound moral stance. Through it all, Ruby remained by his side, supporting him when anxiety threatened to overwhelm him. The safe apartment became their temporary home base, a humble sanctuary where they shared simple meals, pored over legal documents, and comforted each other late into the night. Sometimes Ruby caught Dean gazing at her with an intense warmth in his eyes, and she felt her heart skip a beat, sensing that their bond had grown far beyond mere friendship. At last, a pivotal hearing arrived. Ms. Donovan argued passionately in court, presenting undeniable proof of Dean's setup. A subsequent investigation revealed forged signatures, tampered records, and secret accounts linking the fraudulent activity to his ex-partner. The judge, initially skeptical, grew more convinced with each piece of evidence. After several tense sessions, the final ruling cleared Dean of any wrongdoing. His name was officially exonerated. The media swarmed him outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and reporters shouted questions. Dean took a deep breath and stepped up to a small podium. Ruby stood off to the side, heart pounding. She watched as Dean gave a short, sincere speech about owning his past mistakes, thanking the people who stood by him, and vowing to use his future success, whatever form it took, to help those less fortunate. He ended his speech by pointing to Ruby, who blinked in surprise under the bright camera lights. "I owe this woman my life," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "She showed me kindness when I had nothing, and she gave me hope on the darkest night of my life. If there's a lesson I've learned, it's that we should never forget our common humanity. I promise I won't." Applause erupted, though some in the crowd looked puzzled, unsure of who Ruby was. Tears burned at her eyes as she smiled. The tension melted from her body, replaced by a sense of joyful relief. Dean stepped away from the podium, ignoring the barrage of follow-up questions, and took Ruby's hand. They pushed through the crowd, refusing further interviews, determined to leave behind the chaos of the courthouse steps. In the days that followed, Dean received multiple offers, speaking engagements, job proposals, even invitations to collaborate on new business ventures. He considered each one carefully, remembering the lessons he learned on the street. He resolved to use whatever new platform he gained to uplift those in need. Meanwhile, Ruby faced her own crossroads. She had lived on the streets for so long that the concept of a stable life felt alien. Yet, with Dean by her side, she dared to dream of a new beginning. While the safe apartment was only temporary, it gave her a taste of what could be possible: a job, a home, the chance to reignite her aspiration to teach or guide others. One evening, Dean returned from a meeting with a philanthropic organization. Ruby was flipping through a local community college pamphlet, her interest piqued by some adult education courses. Dean quietly approached her, a soft smile curving his lips. Without warning, he placed a small box on the table, a familiar black box. Ruby's heart pounded as she realized what it was. He opened it, revealing the delicate gold necklace with a heart pendant. "I wanted to give you this on a special day," he said, voice steady with emotion. "But then I thought, every day we're alive and free is special. And you deserve this more than anyone I've ever known." Ruby's eyes shimmered with tears. Her throat felt tight as he gently lifted the necklace out and approached her. "May I?" he asked, holding the pendant near her collarbone. She nodded, unable to speak. He fastened it around her neck. The heart pendant rested against her skin, small and brilliant, a symbol of all they had overcome together. She touched it gingerly, feeling the smooth gold beneath her fingertips. "Dean," she finally managed, voice thick with emotion, "I thank you." He gave her hands a tender squeeze. "You deserve more than a necklace, Ruby. You deserve a life filled with love, safety, and happiness. I promise I'll do everything in my power to help you find that life." In that intimate moment, words became unnecessary. Their eyes locked, and the warmth passing between them spoke of an affection that had grown quietly in the shadows, nurtured by kindness and compassion. Slowly, Dean leaned closer, and Ruby felt her pulse quicken. When their lips met, it was soft and tentative at first, but soon blossomed into a gentle promise of a shared future. They pulled apart, breathless yet calm, as if something fragile but precious had finally found its rightful place. Ruby rested her forehead against Dean's, tears of happiness sliding down her cheeks. She remembered the cold alley, the rainy night, the sense of hopelessness that had gripped her heart on her birthday. Now she stood in a quiet living room with a man who had once been a millionaire, both of them changed forever by hardship and kindness. In the following weeks, their lives took new shapes. Dean partnered with charitable organizations to create housing initiatives for homeless individuals. Ruby enrolled in adult education classes, stepping toward a potential career in community outreach. They found a modest apartment together, away from the shadows of the old alley. While they did not have much wealth, they shared something far more valuable: love, understanding, and a determination to lift each other up. On a sunny afternoon, a few months after the court ruling, Dean surprised Ruby by bringing out a small, store-bought cake with a single candle on top. "I know we missed your birthday," he said, eyes crinkling with affection, "but I promised you I'd celebrate it properly someday." Ruby's smile lit up the room as she blew out the candle. She made a silent wish for their future to remain bound by hope no matter the challenges ahead. Dean clapped softly, then leaned over and kissed her cheek. A warm glow filled the tiny kitchen. They had come a long way from that desolate alley. On a night that once seemed hopeless, fate had brought them together, a homeless woman on her birthday and a millionaire at his lowest point. Now, with hearts mended by compassion and sealed by love, they faced a new tomorrow. And as they stood there, hand in hand, cake crumbs on their plates, they both knew their story was only just beginning.